Hello everyone, this is Kat. Welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 41, chapter 41, entitled Set Back and Set Up to Come Back. Midori was an idiot. An actual fucking buffoon. How, in all that had happened since his first day at UA, did he have neither Aizawa or Yamada's number? Scrolling through his phone 3 times past all the contact information his classmates had entered in after he had returned from the USJ incident. It just wasn't there. He lived with them, for God's sake. Sure, it had been almost a month, but if there was any number that he should have had, it would have been one of theirs. He could have called one of them, warned them about what Ida was likely planning to do, what would happen. It was risky, trying to interrupt a premonition so early, but damn it, he was desperate, and panicking, and he didn't want Ida to die, but it was going to happen, and it would be all his fault. Waiting for morning to come was actual hell. A combination of nonstop pacing and thoughts about the deep, contradicting desire to collapse into himself and cry. He'd broken out of Gami's arms halfway through the hours of pure restlessness, and he knew the ghost was only trying to talk some sense into him right now, but it was falling on deaf ears. One thing had stuck with him, however. He needed to talk with Gran Torino. He couldn't tell the elder about his extra abilities, even with Ida's life on the line, as selfish as it was. He couldn't handle the stress of another near stranger knowing the one intimate secret he was trying to take to his grave, especially someone with a relationship, however old, with All Might. He couldn't do it. There was just this knot in his throat, and no matter how hard he tried, it was not going to let loose those words and let them come out. Because of that, Ida was going to die. Midori thought of himself as a pretty damn good liar, however, and if there was one thing he was going to do, it was going to be convincing Gran Torino to take him on night patrols in Hosu, so they could just so happen to be patrolling the dark, residential alleys of the city, so they could just so happen to stumble upon the hero killer, so they could just so happen to catch him before Ida came looking for revenge. That was why he was waiting, quite impatiently, in the main space, seated at the small kitchen table with a glass of water Gami had made him take in order to try and calm down. It was, in fact, not working, by the way his leg had bounced uncontrollably in the wake of the overwhelming situation. He shouldn't have been so stressed, not from a logical standpoint. The premonition was dark, and not just by the natural shadow of the alley. The lighting had to have been because of the dark night sky. Logically, nothing was going to happen right now, only a couple of hours after the sun had risen, but he couldn't stop himself from checking his soul count this morning. No Ida to his immediate yet short relief. Was he supposed to do this for the rest of his life? With everyone he loved? Surely not. Surely only heroes like them would have death knocking at their front door like this. They were only students. He was merely a child. Surely this was not how it was supposed to be. Midori's chest tightened at the thought of seeing Todoroki or Uraraka's corpse in his head. His breath stuttered at the thought of seeing Aizawa's mutilated body in another vision. He instinctively flinched at the thought of them, or anyone else that he loved, hating his existence for a reason that he could not understand, wanting him gone when he could no longer bear to leave, wanting him dead when he could not fulfill and die. And no one told him this came with the job. No one had told him much of anything. It all hurt so much, and he didn't want to hurt anymore. Hadn't he been hurt enough? He couldn't keep making friends, offering out his heart, if he was always going to end up like this. He was better off alone. He'd always be better off alone. No more of that. Gami sat in the chair across from him, resting his arms on the table. You're going to take a breath. You're going to speak with Gran Torino, and you are going to go to Hosu in time to prevent this, regardless of if those events correlate. Midori reached out to take his mentor's skeletal hands, gripping his finger so tight he could feel the ghostly bone remnants dig into his skin. He took a breath. He was going to lie his ass off to Gran Torino, a retired hero, and if he wanted to make sure that he didn't get caught, going down a spiral was not going to help. He wasn't going to let anything happen to Ida, even if he really didn't want to talk to him ever again. Even if he really did hate his presence so vividly, even if he really didn't care about him anymore, Ida was still in there somewhere, just like with Todoroki, and the underworld would freeze over before he would ever give up on getting that back. He'd had a taste of company, and of peace that came with it, and God be damned if he didn't want to go back to being alone anymore. A door clicked open. Not surprised to see you up, but I am surprised to see you sitting here. You need something? Midori snapped his head up, nearly jumping out of his skin. He stumbled over his words, leaking out of his lips from a more uncoordinated fashion than he had desired. Can we go to Hosu? As soon as it spilled out, he laughed one of those uncontrollable laughs like that to pull himself to the deepest pits of his stomach, a slow and tedious climb that dug sharply into his sides with no remorse. Let me rephrase that, he backtracked. I want to go on a night patrol to, test out what I've been working on, mobility-wise. I don't mean fighting or anything. Gran Torino narrowed his eyes, crossing his arms cynically. You want to go on a patrol? At night? In Hosu? He didn't even have to say it for the implication to smother him like a thick fog. He shook his hands out in front of him, slapping on a nervous smile that wasn't intentional but certainly didn't make him look any better. I just think it's where my skills would be best put to use. My quirk is most useful in an urban environment, and my costume is optimized for stealth in the dark. Hosu City Center is more developed than here, so practicing urban mobility would be easier. He wished that he'd started with that, with how smoothly it all rolled off his tongue now, but he held in the gripes with a painted smile, and his stomach had tied itself into knots waiting on a response. He didn't dare lock eyes with Gami, still seated across from him, much too afraid to move in fear of accidentally interacting with the chair he was in. He didn't dare to even look at the ghost, afraid to break the tension in the space, afraid to break his mentor's deep concentration on his stability, afraid to break the breath that had trapped in his lungs. Gran Torino was the first to change the picturesque scene, uncrossing his arms and continuing to use his cane instead. He huffed like an old engine, tired from overuse and worn from disrepair. Well, if you're talking about mobility practice, night patrol isn't great for a first time. He placed a hand at his chin in thought. How about we start with the day patrol? See where we go from there. Midori opened his mouth to respond, but Gran Torino shooed him off before he could even utter a word. Go put on your costume. Meet me on the roof. And to really seal the deal, the elder walked off and up the stairs, leaving the duo alone with the ramifications of what had just occurred. Gami caught the look of growing disappointment on his successor's face and stood up quickly from his seat, accidentally pushing the chair back with a harsh screech, but that was ignored by all as he had floated over briskly. That was not a no. You should take this opportunity to enjoy yourself, to train like you wanted. You were looking forward to Gran Torino getting involved like this. Do not let yourself taint it. Midori shrunk unconsciously. I can't. Ida is still in danger. I should be trying to stop the premonition. I can't be wasting time like this. You are not wasting time. The vision did not take place during daylight hours. If anything, this is more to have under your belt in case anything does go wrong. Neither felt like elaborating on that. Gami crouched a bit to be at eye level with Midoriya, placing both hands firmly on his shoulders. Nothing is going to happen to Ida now. As night begins to approach, we'll figure out our course of action, yes, but there is nothing to do now. So go, do what you came here to do. Do not let this opportunity slip past you. The teen picked at his gloves, biting away at his inner cheek. Why did he bother to question at all? Gami had never been wrong before. Why would he start now? Okay. He stood up from the chair, too, Gami's arms naturally falling off his shoulders from the height difference. The bounce in his heels wasn't intentional, but it certainly didn't make him feel any worse. Yeah, okay. I'll try. The ghost chuckled in delight, the rare occurrence almost enough to wipe away all of Midoriya's worries, and enthusiastically had pushed him forward, up the stairs, and back into his room. Not even 15 minutes later, Midori opened the unlocked rooftop door, fully adorned in all of his gear, while Gran Torino was patiently waiting in a garb of his own. He could have sworn the elder cracked a smile, but with an enigma like Gran Torino, he could never be sure. Midori wasn't one to question others, especially not in a confrontational way, but he couldn't help the curiosity mixed with the nervousness in his gut for a potentially potent cocktail. So, what are we doing up here? I thought you wanted to start with day patrol. Gran Torino locked up the rooftop door, and this time he could hear the smirk in his voice. How else did you think we were going to practice your mobility? I did tell you to wait on the rooftop, hopping for a reason. You aren't serious, are you? He balked as the hero had moved back to the edge of the roof. I don't know what I'm doing. I haven't really learned how to make still blasts yet. If I jump, I'm not going to make it. Sounded like you knew what you were doing yesterday, and trust me, I'm not going to let you fall from up here. So relax, will you? It was almost like a command, and Midori felt the instinctual need to follow it. He found himself walking on autopilot to the edge beside Gran Torino. The natural wind from their elevation swirled past him, almost carrying him down his path. Running through his hair like phantom fingers, it wasn't nearly as strong as yesterday, but it was enough for him to worry about his hat staying on. There's a few steps to a good standing long jump, even with a quirk that can give you extra propulsion, Gran Torino explained, throwing aside his cane in one swift, punctual movement. He cracked a few of his bones, letting the echo drift off the wind. First, he bent down into a deep squat. You're going to want to crouch hard onto your heels. Bring your arms back, rock a little on your feet, and get a sense of how your weight shifts. Midori stood awkwardly for a moment before realizing the elder was waiting on him to copy, so he rushed to fit into the same formation, adjusting his stance to keep himself balanced every so often. You want to keep your eyes forward.
When you start to look down, your jump shifts down. I would tell you to swing your hands forward once you jump, but since your propulsion comes from your fingers, keep your hands back. Let them move naturally. If your explosion pushes them forward, then make sure you keep them around your shoulder height." Gran Torino then pulled his heels up, balancing on the tip of his toes, and Midori moved to copy him, but the hero shook his head. "My propulsion comes from the soles of my feet, and you want to angle your propulsion perpendicular to the direction you want to go. I keep my feet flat. I'm going to go up, not out." He flexed his fingers as a following gesture. "Since your propulsion is coming from your hands, keep your feet flat. Make sure to angle your hands opposite to the arc of your jump." Midori readjusted, getting an approval from Gran Torino. "When you land into your feet. Sink into your feet to absorb the shock or you'll fall over. Bending at the hips and knees helps too." The teen nodded, taking it all in. "That's all there is to it," he chirped. "You put that all together." Suddenly, the hero had launched himself off the edge of the rooftop, a blast of air from his quirk ruffling Midoriya's outfit completely out of place. He soared like nothing he'd ever seen, a symphonic dissonance of grace and power lasting merely a moment as he had crashed down onto the rooftop of the building in front of them. He landed perfectly on his feet, like a cat with one life left and all the confidence in the world. Gran Torino stood up straight again, brushing himself off and turning back to Midoriya. "And with a bit of practice, you'll get the hang of it in no time." Midori was already in position, but he shuffled anyway, flattening his feet, keeping his arms back, locking his eyes forward. His gloves were off, the bare skin of his hands clammy not from the cold or temperature. He tried to remember how he'd done it yesterday. He stretched his fingers out like yesterday, and he let the wind embrace him like yesterday, submitting complete control to its wisps and its trails. He took a deep breath, letting the air pull in his lungs like yesterday, and suddenly he forgot about all his stress entirely, or rather the wind had taken it from him and naturally forgot itself. And with a momentary rush of confidence he just jumped, an explosion ripping behind him at his beck and call. He soared. Flying was an exhilarating, peaceful experience. He was almost disappointed he'd never gotten to do this earlier. The weightlessness that came with being completely surrounded by air on all sides was not a feeling he was expecting, but not an unwelcome one. It was so freeing. He was so free. He relished in it. Was this how Uraraka felt when she used her quirk on herself? Why would she ever want to come down? He was so wrapped up in it all, he forgot to land. Tumbling into a heap on the rooftop, he just slid a few feet in front of Gran Torino, bones aching and skin burning and muscles cramping. "Were you trying to land?" The hero approached him slowly. "You were doing a pretty good job up until then." Midori pulled himself onto his rear, sitting loosely on the top of the roof of a building next door to Gran Torino's apartment, separated by a gap of at least 15 feet. He laughed. He laughed, and he laughed, and he laughed until his sides had started to hurt from more than just his landing, and even then he continued to laugh some more. His smile stretched far across his cheeks, soaking up the sun above them. He had leaned back onto his hands and breathed out, chuckles where he could, unable to stop the pure joy from exploding from within him, his neglected heart unable to contain it all. Gran Torino scoffed teasingly. "Yeah, your first time jumping off a roof will do that to you." Midori looked up at him, his hair wind-blown from exhilaration, his eyes drunk from euphoria, his bones trembling from enthusiasm. The hero offered him a hand. "Want to do it again?" And Midori took it, clasping his bare hand with Gran Torino's gloved one in a firm grip that ended as a lift normally would, with two intact hands. "Do I?" It was Gran Torino's turn to laugh as he led him to the edge of that rooftop, and they jumped and they jumped and jumped, and sometimes Midori forgot where he was. Sometimes he forgot to land, sometimes he even forgot to breathe. Each time he jumped, the wind took something from his mind, replacing it instead with peace that utterly filled him to his core. But Gran Torino never had to catch him. Midori even jumped first after some time, clutching his hat to his head as he chased his high. He did land on his feet that time, spinning on his heels to face Gran Torino as the hero made his jump. "You know, that hat's not doing you any favors," he called out over the deafening rush of the wind and adrenaline. "You might want to get something more practical if you're going to keep jumping like this." Midori laughed. He was almost starting to get tired of it, but that was too much of a lie to even think about saying aloud. "Tell me about it." Midori returned back to Gran Torino's apartment just as worn out as the building's skin had looked. Lungs heaving like the shamefully undertrained hero student he was. If he was thinking objectively, then he would have understood how pointless the day patrol was to his priorities. There was no chance of ever encountering the hero killer in the few hours they were going to be out. It was the wrong time, the wrong place, the wrong environment. Everything was just so disjointed, with the haunting image of Ida's body impaled into the pavement that If he was truly thinking objectively, there was no way he could justify the outing as anything more than frivolous. Instead, he came back guiltily uplifted, spirit high from his altitude, lungs heaving from the overwhelming rush of adrenaline that he'd never felt before, born from absolute exhilaration instead of the fear and desperation that he was so used to. He came back with a stupid little grin on his face, one much too similar to his childhood naivety days. It was all more preparation for the inevitable. It was all just to have more under his belt so he stood a better chance at saving Ida. That's what he told himself. That's how he justified it. Surprisingly, Gran Torino held true to his word, and they went out on a night patrol after the Elder's daily dose of naps and tea. It was more surprising than it should have been. If Midori had been thinking objectively, then it would have been obvious how much Gran Torino had changed from the completely uninterested old man he was on the first day. But his head was filled with flying and fear, with thoughts so focused and chaotic that if anyone dared to peek, they wouldn't have known what they were looking at. They didn't go to Hosu, much to the teen's chagrin, nor did they encounter anything which, in Midoriya's mangled mess of mind, he was torn on whether to feel relieved or disappointed. Gran Torino seemed pretty pleased with the monotony, but then again, Gran Torino didn't have a ticking timer in his head with a final chime of a certain death for one of his closest and most beloved friends, now did he? Only one person got to sleep peacefully that night. The other was only forcefully pulled to rest after hours of apathetically shifting through the masses, only to finally feel an emotion in relief as the sun had rose and his search remained in failure. Midori wasn't sure when he became so out of touch with his own emotions. He wasn't sure when he'd lost the ability to cry, when he most needed to, only for it to hit him so like vulnerability, like a forgotten boomerang. It should have concerned him more, but between the rooted priorities and admittedly uncontrollable emotions, that very notion just slipped his mind. It was now day 2 for his vision, and the fact that he wasn't holding Ida in his hands was enough of a victory to let everything else slide. Still, despite the fact that he didn't go to Hosu at all yesterday, was something that he could not afford to do again. He got lucky last night, that was it. Lucky. There was nothing stopping his premonition from occurring yesterday other than absolute luck, and even if his luck was the best ever known to man, he would never take that risk willingly, not while he had a choice. He didn't care that it looked odd and suspicious to be waiting for Gran Torino to awaken a second day in a row with a repeating demand to patrol Hosu at night. He could take any generalization and assumptions thrown at him. He always had, though before he'd stomached it out of force. This time he stood his ground willingly. I was hoping we could go to Hosu tonight. He gave Gran Torino a moment to get falsely settled this time. You know, since yesterday went so well. The hero actively seemed to fight with himself, rather than immediately shut down like yesterday. I'll admit I was impressed by your quick learning yesterday, but I took a risk taking you out last night. We were lucky not to encounter anything with crime rates spiking. Midori immediately fell into defense that was so natural when it wasn't his own well-being on the line. I can protect myself, and I need to be out there protecting other people. Is that so? Gran Torino looked at him strangely. It's not what it looked like the first day. The teen wasn't expecting to be wounded so deeply, and he flinched hard into his skin. He grinded his teeth, swallowing pointless words and insecurities. He hated this. He hated when he wasn't right. Why was everyone else always right? Why couldn't he get it right for once? He could hear the ugly sound of scraping metal ringing about in his ears. He could taste the chilling bite of iron rust in his mouth. He could see madness and death in his eyes. It all flashed before him like a gut punch, reminding him how important it was to get this right, even if it was the only opportunity he'd ever get to be right in his lifetime. But it has been few days, he continued suddenly, and seeing your improvement yesterday, it's only fair of me to give you another chance. Gran Torino threw his cane to the side, standing up straight from his usual hunch. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a stopwatch. No one would have owned them for no good reason. So let's try that first day again. I'll give you 3 minutes, no costumes, no nonsense. And in a swift movement that neither Midori nor Gami was prepared for, Gran Torino had snapped behind him. Show me you can protect yourself. The teen was less than prepared as a boot, with the weight of the world plowed into his abused back. He had stumbled into a crowd, desperate to try and guard his blind spots with minimal coverage. Gami, who'd remained eerily quiet throughout the whole ordeal, growled through his teeth. Dishonorable ratbag. Midori almost responded back, but the air, as well as the toxicity in his lungs, was forcibly expelled as the elder crashed into his chest like a cannonball that sent him to the floor. Pitiful! Gran Torino mocked him from as many angles. If your reactions are this paltry, then you won't be able to save anyone, will you? His frustration fueled him from his disgraceful place against the tile, but as quickly as he got back up, the hero just kicked him back down again.
The hits weren't heavy, just numerous, more than he could ever hope to take on like this, and by the way Gami had struggled to grab him like a phantom game of cat and mouse, his speed was much too immense to face head-on. Midori stuck to the floor like the scavenger he was, managing to get a lucky prediction and rolling out of the way of a single crushing blow. The second to breathe came like a grace from paradise. He just needed some breathing room, some room to collect his thoughts and form a more strategic plan, other than his current goal of survival. "You almost had him that time," Gami shouted as he tackled Midori out of the way of another kick, the teen adding some last-minute dramatics to fake the movement. "You predicted how he would move. You just gave him too much time to react." Midori took another blow mid-air, again crashing to the floor. He did predict Gran Torino's movements last time, based on the pattern of attacking him from behind, and he used that to lure him into a movement he would know in advance. But this time it looked like if Gran Torino was adjusting his strategy, he was fighting in a more blatantly offensive manner compared to his sneak attacks from before. He couldn't predict where the hero was going to hit him from. There were just too many options. His eyes aligned with the busted couch Gran Torino often sat at throughout the day, staring right down at the large gap created by its long legs. If there were too many options before, he'd just have to make it so that there was only one. And like the pathetic scavenger he was, he didn't waste a second diving underneath the cover. He barely squeezed underneath, but the couch served its purpose, shielding him from all sides except the blind spot above, allowing him just a second of breathing room, but that was all he needed, to take off his gloves, to outstretch his fingers, to remember how to fly. He could only hear a rush of air just above him, cutting through the atmosphere like the sharp blade of an unforgiving sword. But Gami was his eyes. Now! The wind took nothing from him this time as the couch exploded upwards. Gran Torino dodged the sofa, but was still knocked off balance as his light body was thrown into the air by just the force of the blast, and that was all the opening Midoriya needed. Shattering the tile beneath him as he rocketed upward, the force of two blasts at once, clouding the air with dust and fragments. He wound a hand back behind his head, DT coiling in his veins, and with a scream that encapsulated all his blood, sweat, and tears, he launched forward, ripping the air apart in a massive explosion that shook the whole neighborhood. Midori didn't need Gami's call-out to know that he'd missed, feeling the stream of air just behind him. He crashed back down to the floor, returning to all fours like he was used to, his back prominently exposed and looking like the biggest bullseye he would have ever seen. "Izuku, he's behind me!" He whipped back, with a tremendous amount of speed, eyes locking with an incoming Gran Torino. He'd gotten the prediction just right, just like last time, but last time the hero had easily dodged and countered his blatant attack, even with his newly refined movements. If it didn't work last time, it wasn't going to work again. He needed something more creative, something more unexpected, something more like Gran Torino. With a smooth standing long jump, Midori flew up, not out. He leapt over Gran Torino, soaring higher and higher until his back was flushed with the ceiling. And the moment he felt the resistance, knowing that he had no more room to keep flying, he launched back down, one hand outstretched just above the hero's shocked expression. The explosion was ripped from him, shattering his world into clouds of dust as his form was knocked out of line. So much sound had flooded his ears. He couldn't hear if Gran Torino had crashed into the floor. He had to have gotten him. There was no way he could have dodged a blast that big from such a close proximity. "Your left. He's coming." Gami couldn't even finish his sentence as Midori was plowed into the wall by a bullet of a man. His poor spine took the brunt of it all, cracking once against the impact and a second time as he slid to the floor, crumbling into a heap. Gami rushed to his side to help him stand, feeling his successor shake violently in his arms. Gran Torino landed in front of his collapsed body, stopwatch in hand. "And that's 3 minutes. "Damn it!" The teen barely managed to hiss out as his arms gave out on him, Gami sneakily navigating his unresponsive body to lean against the wall instead of going face first into the floor again. He heaved, desperate to get air into his battered lungs, his eyes shut painfully as he waited for the aches to pass and Gran Torino's inevitable mockery to replace it. But when a tense silence was the only thing to come, he peeked an open eye up hesitantly. His gaze naturally drifted to Gami, who was still curved protectively around him, but his focus was fixed forward. Midori moved to match him, locking onto Gran Torino's still standing form in front of him, a gloved hand running across his bruised cheek with a smile. "Don't know about you." He pulled his hand back, revealing slight specks of blood stained into his glove. "But compared to 4 days ago, that's quite the improvement. Your mobility's on par with your prediction and analysis." Midori tried to scramble forward, but Gami held him back out of concern. I didn't mean..." Gran Torino walked toward him, stopping just at his feet. "You did mean."
You meant with every fiber of your being to catch me off guard, just as I meant with every fiber of my being to dodge out of the way, but I couldn't." He chuckled lightly to himself. "You got me." The elder then stepped back, turning around to grab his cup of tea that had managed to stay unharmed on the kitchen counter throughout the ordeal. "Take the rest of the day to rest and practice a bit. I'll take you around Yamanashi tonight, or for some extra experience. Hosu can be a bit volatile, I'm sure you know." He took a slow sip, retreating back into his room despite the chaos of wreckage around the main space, and Midori's shell-shocked expression off to the side. The teen unconsciously had relaxed into Gami's arms a few seconds after, left alone with his thoughts and the absolute mess around him, both equally as scattered. "Are you all right?" Midori would have waved him off, but his muscles were much too strained to even think about moving. Exhaustion had hit him like a truck after the heat of the battle, adrenaline wearing off and leaving him to his consequences. It was a bad habit of his, one he was certain he'd be stuck with for a long time. He looked down at his hands, struggling to even crane his neck to see his fingers still, unable to feel anything but fatigue in his nerves. Slowly but surely, however, he was getting better. "Yeah," he stuttered, the effort getting caught in his lungs. "Just give me a second." Gami nodded, slipping his arms out from around his successor and letting him lean against the wall freely. "It sounded as if Gran Torino was agreeing to take you to Hosu tomorrow." The teen hummed in agreement, giving up on the effort to form words. Gami cocked his head cautiously at the lack of verbal response, pausing to collect his thoughts. "And your feelings?" Midori visibly deflated, any relative victory stolen from him. "I mean, it's good that we'll be there tomorrow, having Gran Torino as potential backup's a great plus, but we can't afford to leave Hosu on monitor tonight." He pushed himself upright in his seriousness, ignoring Gami's parental noises of distress. "We got lucky last night, and if we bet on getting lucky again tonight, we're betting Ida's life, and I can't do that. I'm sickened that I took that risk yesterday, just to begin with." "But you could not have gone yesterday, not while also on a night patrol with Gran Torino," Gami argued. "And you cannot go tonight either." Midori looked up at his mentor wryly. "You doubt my sneakiness that much?" "No, that is not what I mean. You could very well sneak out tonight, but Gran Torino would surely realize that you're missing, and if he plans to patrol with you again tonight, and he understands that you snuck away, he would not allow you to sneak out again, much less let you patrol in Hosu tomorrow." The dry facade of humor slipped as Midori clenched a fist. I know it's either tonight or tomorrow, but I can't pick which day to go to Hosu and hope that I get it right. I can't bet Ida's life like that." Remnants of sorrow he thought were exhausted that first night threatened to build up again. He needed to get out of this night patrol in Yamanashi somehow, but his mind couldn't think of a way out as long as Gran Torino was with him. Their fight just now was proof enough that the old hero far outclassed him. There was no way he could get away during their patrol. Going after would likely be too late, and going before would get him grounded tomorrow. Either way, it was tonight or tomorrow, but he couldn't take that risk. If only he could somehow do both, be in both places at once, patrol with Gran Torino tonight and also be in Hosu at the same time, but of course the hero had to stick with Yamanashi tonight, leaving him stuck here. Midori's eyes went wide, some hidden sparkle in his irises. It glistened for just a moment before fading away, right as he had swiveled his head towards Gami. "I can't sneak off, but you can." The ghost almost jumped back in surprise. "What?" "You can be in Hosu tonight, Gami. You can be there while I'm with Gran Torino, and if you even see a glimpse of Ida or the hero killer, you can come right back to get me. At that point, it won't matter if we can convince Gran Torino to let us go. We'll just have to lose him, because we'll know anyway, and we can go and save Ida, and nothing will matter anymore." "But," Gami shuffled nervously, a trait unlike him, "I will be so far away from you." "Please, Gami, this is our best shot. Ida's counting on us, whether he realizes it or not." Midori latched onto his dark cloak, his fingers sinking into foggy fabric. "You're my partner. I can't do this without you." The ghost shrunk in on himself, dimming under Midori's wide and desperate stare. Something ugly pulled in his gut, something completely alien to him. He wanted to say no. He couldn't think of a moment in his afterlife where he'd ever wanted to say no to Midori for any reason, but out of the blue, something screamed at him to refuse and stay by the boy's side as he always did. Something so overpowering he nearly gave in without a second thought. But Midori's grip on his robe only became tighter, forcing Gami to return focus to his gaze as the desperation hit him secondhand. Midori needed him, and never in his afterlife had he purposely failed to help, to do something, when Midori needed him to. He loved him. He promised to always be there for him, because he loved him, and suddenly even the thought of no was banished from his thoughts.
Gami sighed. All right, I will go. Midori visibly slumped in relief, burying his face into his mentor's cloak. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gami. And Gami slumped too, piling himself on top of Midori's head and resting on his hair. Of course, we are a team. Who would I be to turn away from you when you need me? The shrill calls of refusal from before had died off, his spirit satisfied being so close to Midori right now. Still, even the thought of leaving him tonight had his form growing wispy. If he wasn't the best liar in the world before, he sure was now. Midori laughed into his robe. You're the best partner I could ever ask for. I'm so lucky to have you. Gami ignored how his body physically grew ill at that word, instead drowning out that sensation with the peace brought to his spirit at being by Midori's side. Remember, he likes to attack in quiet, residential alleys away from the city, especially areas that are dark and generally have a lower count of civilians. Midoriya, fully adorned in his hero costume, instructed Gami, who floated nervously by the wall. Stay there and check for those parts over and over again. Don't go into the heart of the city unless you hear something suspicious. Gami nodded, albeit a bit less enthusiastically than normal. And how long shall I be out again? Midori's shoulders dropped as he looked away in sadness. Until the sun rises. It's going to be a long night for the both of us. Gami again grew eagerly reluctant to refuse this whole thing and just stay at his successor's side, but once more he quashed the overwhelming feeling to the pits of his soul. Midori suddenly had jumped in to hug him briefly, unaware of how painfully tight the ghost had gripped back. I know you don't really want to do this, but it's part of being a hero. People rely on us to keep them safe, and sometimes that means that we have to make sacrifices because we can and they can't. Ida needs us to keep him safe because we're the only ones who can. I know, but it should not just be us. It should not just be you. There was a sad smile on the teen's face that Gami couldn't see. I know. Maybe one day, but right now, I've only got you. They broke the embrace, Midori barely confident enough to look him in the eye. I need to get going, or Gran Torino will wonder what's taking me so long. Remember, even a glimpse, and you come get me. Gami nodded again, running a skeletal hand through the bit of Midori's hair that's peeking out from under his hat. Promise me you will be safe. Midori touched the cold hand with his own. Of course. The same goes for you. It was clear neither wanted the moment to break and move on, so Midori did it for both of them, stepping back and toward the door of his room. Gami watched in longing and slight hints of distress as he lost the sight of his successor, wallowing in it all for a moment before solemnly drifting through the wall and out the building. Midori only moved up the stairs when he was sure that he couldn't hear the ghost anymore. He opened the rooftop door without warning, catching Gran Torino's attention immediately. He pointlessly had shut the door behind him, starting to walk away only after realizing the hero still had to lock it, causing him to stop awkwardly, and Gran Torino passed him to do just that. Stuffing the mess of keys afterward into some pocket of his costume, Midori was surprised that he had. I can feel your bad mood from here, he scoffed, but it had no real malice. Thought you wanted to do a night patrol. Midori hadn't realized that he was so disappointed, but knowing only made him struggle to contain it even more. I know, The words died off before he could even think about catching them. Gran Torino's eyes stayed narrowed, but his gaze softened. Hosu's a mess right now. I'm not comfortable bringing you in with no experience whatsoever. We're going to encounter something for sure there, and I need to know that you can handle yourself before we get a one-way ticket to the injury-on-duty ward. The teen nodded understandingly, taking in a slow breath. I get it. I'm very grateful for you taking me out on another night patrol at all. That's not necessary either. Gran Torino waved him off. Just shake yourself out of whatever funk you've got right now so we can get started. The elder strolled over to the edge of the rooftop, almost in the same spot that he'd taught Midori how to properly long jump. Midori shook his head, trying to shake the pressing thoughts out of his mind. Gami would be all right. He would be all right. He wanted his mentor to trust in his abilities alone tonight. What kind of hypocrite would he be if he didn't do the same? He rushed over to the edge, beside Gran Torino. The hero gave him an affirming nod, then jumped to the next roof without even a word. Midori followed suit, mimicking Gran Torino's movements as they scoured Yamanashi. I'm sure you've already figured this out, he called over the rush of wind in the middle of a jump. But this part of Yamanashi isn't all that lively. There aren't a lot of residents or businesses around here, so I doubt that we'll encounter anything. Tonight we'll just be practicing those patrol basics I went over yesterday. Midori landed next to him, far more gracefully than his first time. The iron soles of his boots made a soft clink, but that was his only noise. He wordlessly had scanned the immediate area, his eyes peering through the relative darkness, his ears honed on the slightest sounds. He suddenly stood up from his crouch, gesturing a thumb over to the side. We can start that way. It's quieter than the rest of the immediate area, and I think it gets more commercial over there. Gran Torino didn't approve or disapprove, merely nodding his head.
Lead the way.
Midoriya rocketed to the next building, cringing slightly at how loud his takeoff was, but other than the inevitable noise of his blast each time he jumped, he was quiet in all other facets. Each time he landed, he took a few moments to silently assess the area, then choosing his next direction based on the highest risk factor, although in a place like Yamanashi there wasn't much of a risk of anything, other than structural integrity. The duo landed on another set of seemingly endless rooftops, and Midoriya took in his surroundings, as he had all the times before. Gran Torino quietly held up a fist, catching it out of the corner of his eye. The Tina turned to him, stilling every function of his body to a slow crawl. The hero gestured wordlessly to the left, then motioned at his ear. Midori strained his hearing, and very faintly he could make out a soft clicking noise from just below them. He locked serious eyes with Gran Torino, but the elder merely held out a flat hand, motioning for him to wait. Midori didn't argue, but still crept forward with Gran Torino as he got closer to the edge of the rooftop. His eyes readjusted numerously as he stared down at the shadowed alley below. There was something moving just below them, hunched by the alley wall and completely shielded by shadow. The soft clicking was just a bit louder now, strangely akin to the sharp sound of metal. Midori narrowed his focus further. It was most definitely a person, and they seemed to be standing by a door. Doors and alleys were usually a side exit for buildings or businesses. They were trying to lockpick the door. Gran Torino realized that too, holding up his fist once more before suddenly leaping off the roof and into the alley from above. Midori watched the hero crash into the suspicious person, feet plowing into their back. Even he couldn't help but wince at the display, his own spine running phantom pains through his nerves. Their subsequent cry of shock and pain followed suit, a sharp clang of a lockpick clattering to the pavement. Gran Torino immediately hopped off to the side, making a grab for the dropped tool set, effectively securing the potential weapon. But for a person just having taken a blow from Gran Torino, they suddenly scrambled to their feet with little issue, quickly trying to make it out of the alleyway. Midori balked. He was only able to recover so fast because his body had long been conditioned past death. For someone else, a low-life thief, to do the same, Midori had guessed his quirk had something to do with it, maybe muscle enhancer or a stamina strengthener. He brushed aside his instinctual analysis. The suspect was surprisingly fast. There was a possibility that they could get away, though Gran Torino was insanely agile, so there was really no chance that he wouldn't catch them. But on the off chance, Midori ignored Gran Torino's order. Rocketing himself down to the mouth of the alleyway with a well-directed blast, he landed in a crouch, hat, cloak, and coattails fluttering intimidatingly around him. The person, shocked and unexpecting to see another hero in their path, had stumbled in their getaway. And just as they had stuttered for a split second, Gran Torino tackled them from behind, this time permanently pinning them to the floor with a foot. "I thought I told you to wait up there," the hero pressed cynically, still digging his foot into the person's back. Midori stood, awkwardly scratching his neck. "Sorry, just thought I should cover the exit." Gran Torino sighed, shaking his head. "You got something to restrain them? I'll make a call to the police department." "Yeah, I've got a set of handcuffs in my support pack." Gran Torino waited to remove his foot until he watched Midori physically cuff the perpetrator, then stepped away, stopping off to the side to make his call. It was then, as Midori suddenly let go of his breath that he was holding. The whole thing was just kind of his luck, of course, on arguably the most stressful night of internship so far. Still, as he had tightened the cuffs, something oddly similar to pride had bloomed in his chest. He hadn't even hesitated, just stepping into the fray when he recognized he needed to. Just like that, with no issues. Obviously, he hadn't really done anything, since Gran Torino had taken care of most of the work, but even that reason was minimal in his head. If Gami came back tonight with nothing to report, then all of them would be going to Hosu tomorrow, all of them ready, knowingly or otherwise, to keep Ida safe. And if tonight went like this, then he was sure that everything would be just fine tomorrow. He pressed the person a little rougher into the pavement, just to make sure they didn't squirm loose and make another run for it. Midori wondered how Gami was doing anyway. Midori didn't get any sleep that night. Once he returned from his night patrol with Gran Torino, the anxiety hit him in full force. Gami was still out. Of course Gami was still out. He'd told him to patrol until the sun rose, but he'd never actually been away from his mentor for so long, at least not while conscious. The hours he waited in silence brought him back to the days before he met Gami, how he had struggled alone, lost and confused, desperate for someone to tell him it would all be okay. He felt like he was four again, his life suddenly spiraling out of control. He knew that wasn't really the case, but he couldn't quite tell his mind that. Midori didn't get any sleep that night. He knew he should have tried to rest in case the ghost had returned to retrieve him, or even just for the next day, but his thoughts kept wandering to the worst possible outcome. What if something went wrong? What if Gami Missed it, and it happened anyway. What if something was happening and Gami couldn't get back in time? Their whole plan was scuffed. It was all scuffed, and the brunt of those imperfections was suffocating him, as he could do absolutely nothing. Midori didn't get any sleep that night. He passed the time pacing back and forth, careful not to hit the floorboards that would creak below him. Every couple of minutes he looked through his array of souls, searching for what would result in failure. It brought him momentary peace, but that was nothing in the grand scheme of things, just a sigh of relief immediately drowned out by worry. And what would he do if he found what he was desperately trying to avoid? He didn't know, and that only made him more uneasy. He didn't sleep until Gami returned, which was a little after the sun rose. The minute his mentor had passed through the wall, he crushed him into an instinctual embrace before promptly collapsing of exhaustion in his arms. Midori woke up really late the next morning, uncaring of his break in routine. He stumbled down the stairs in his pajamas, missing how Gran Torino sat expectantly at the table. "You look like a wreck. Did patrol wear you out that much?" He felt like a wreck, and so the comment almost didn't register. The teen had rubbed at his eyes, wiping away dark-circled stains and any wet remnants. He took a second to reorient himself. "Had some trouble sleeping." The hero shot him a concerned look, not that he noticed in his tired state. "You sure you're up to Hosu tonight?" That immediately woke him up. "Yeah, I'm good. We're going?" "We are." Gran Torino nodded agreeingly. "A promise is a promise." And something heavy lifted from Midoriya's heart, a weight that rested overbearingly on his shoulders for the past few days. Today was day 3. It had to happen tonight, and they were all going to Hosu. No more hiding, no more secrets. A little less stress. Ida was going to be okay. He was going to be fine. He would be there to make sure of it. Gran Torino gave him a little wave, making him realize he was way too caught up in thinking. "We aren't leaving for a little while, couple of hours at least. Why don't you take some time to go get yourself ready, eat some lunch or something?" Midoriya nodded sheepishly, allowing Gami to guide him to the kitchen counter. The teen spent the next few hours bouncing between tasks. He cooked, ate, washed dishes. He planned to look at souls again, but Gami pointed out how situationally pointless it was. Instead, he forced him to take the shower that he was neglecting. The shower left him feeling even more drowsy, somehow unaware enough to let his mentor coax him back to bed, and while he would never admit it out loud, he really needed that nap. As the sun approached the other end of the horizon, Midoriya adorned his hero costume once more, a silent hope that it would be the last time for the rest of the internship. While again he'd never admit, but he was running on fumes. He wasn't sure how much more stress his body could take, and honestly, he could use a nice cry and a week's worth of sleep. Gami crept up behind him in the mirror as he fitted his hat precariously on top of his hair, wrapping his cold, wispy arms around him and completely engulfing his back in the fog of his robe. "Deep breaths. We have not failed him yet, so do not start thinking that now." Midori sank into his mentor's hold. "I know, The word got caught in his throat in a painful choke filled with all the feelings he'd been bottling up for the past 2 days. "I know." He moved around to face him. "I am not asking you not to be. I'm asking you to step forward anyway." "I always will." The teen stepped away, double-checking through a mental checklist before exiting his room. He had treaded down the steps lightly, rested and rejuvenated, but never relaxed. Gran Torino was there to meet him, prepped and ready as always. "Ready to go? There's a train leaving in 20 minutes that we can catch if we hurry." "Why are we cutting it so close?" Midoriya stuttered, rushing for the front door. The hero just laughed. "Sure, it's close if we walk, but did you really think that we were going to do that after the past few days?" Gran Torino then launched himself from the front steps to the roof across the street. He landed with a graceful wave directed at the teen. Midoriya huffed, closed the door behind him, and rocketed himself up there too, without missing a beat. Gami flew up to meet him with incredible speed. "Goodness, you are getting good at that." He could only offer a proud smirk of a response in return until he began jumping with Gran Torino, then whispering out a thanks into the air. The wind surely forgot it, but Gami didn't. They arrived at the train station where Midoriya had come into Yamanashi the first day only 10 minutes later. Even still, they rushed to buy cheap, last-minute seats to Hosu, which were fairly cheap on their own due to the crime uptick. It was truly a miracle that they'd made it onto the train before it left. Midoriya sinking into his seat out of momentary relief, only to remember why it was so necessary to make it to Hosu anyway. It wasn't long after the train had started and left the station. A slight jolt was coming from the drive and nothing more. Gami floated next to his seat, but with Gran Torino right beside them, he wouldn't dare utter a word. Instead, his mind had drifted to what was quickly approaching. The sun was almost fully set, just a sliver of light before the sky was plunged into darkness. The premonition happened at dark. In a secluded alley that didn't look to be bothered by the city, that fit the hero killer's profile, how he preferred to attack in residential areas far from city noise. He used sharp weapons and was extremely agile, somehow managing to always incapacitate his target before killing them. Midori wasn't sure how, seeing all these capable heroes unable to fight back as he instigated their demise, but some naive part of him hoped it wouldn't come to that. He'd pull all the stops, outing his secrets, outing Gami if he had to. Ida's life was worth it. Wait a minute. Midori suddenly turned to Gami, who shifted in surprise at the newfound attention, still remaining in his seat next to him. How was he with him? Every time they traveled by vehicle, Gami had to fly alone, passing through the train he used to take to UA and Aizawa's car. What in the absolute world? Had he been able to do this on the way to Gran Torino as well? Gami must have interpreted what he was thinking, because the ghost had shrugged helplessly. I am just as confused as you are. I tried to decipher it on the way here as well. Midori shook his head. He'd have other times to figure that out. Right now he had some other things to worry about, though. Attention passengers, please hold on to your seats. We're currently undergoing an emergency stop. The train lurched violently as a hero crashed through its side, tumbling to the floor of the train car. Midori had choked on air. Gran Torino's eyes widened. The public started to panic, but before they could even utter the start of a scream, another lurch shook the train. A horribly disfigured, four-eyed, lanky-limbed Nomu bursted from the hole already made by the hero, slamming his head into the floor with ease. Midori jumped from his seat as Gran Torino leapt forward to blow back the Nomu with his jets of air, sending it tumbling out of the still train car. Its monstrous screech had echoed in the air as it went reeling from the impact. Gran Torino turned to him with no hesitation. Owari, I'm giving you full permission to use your quirk to defend and protect. And while his ears struggled to process his name or any of the rapidly declining situation around them, his mind commanded without effort, slipping off his gloves once more as the rest of the passengers switched between horror, shock, and relief. He rushed over to the elder hero's side. Standing at the mouth of the gaping hole, he could see the ruins from where the Nomu had made impact with the nearby building, but the creature was no longer there. Meanwhile, the rest of Hosu City burned, the dark night sky now only lit by trails of flames and billowing smoke. Midori didn't even have time to register the sheer horror of the sight as Gran Torino grabbed him by the scruff of his costume. Let's go. And with a powerful jet blast, they both had launched high into the air, higher than the teen could ever have hoped to go, with his blast alone. Midori could only hope that Gami was able to keep up with him. They landed by the impact area, Gran Torino setting the teen down as they both remained high on guard. The Nomu was certainly no longer there, but it had definitely made its mark. Small fires were scattered around the area, though none as big as the ones he saw thriving in the heart of Hosu. Street signs were bent over backwards, windows were smashed. The area alone looked like a ghost town. We need to head to the city, Gran Torino stated bluntly. That's where it probably went. Midori looked around anxiously. But what about the fires? The fire department or a water-based hero will put them out. They're not a concern right now. The logic made sense, as much as his heart wanted to go against him. Plus, wasting time putting out fires would only take away time that he needed to search for Ida. That had to stay his top priority no matter what. He moved to catch up with Gran Torino when one of the small fires caught his eye. It was right in front of a small business, which wasn't peculiar in its own, but it made it odd because the building's lights were still on. Midori took a closer look, trying to peer through the obscuring smoke. There was a person. There was a person inside the building. He wasn't in control at that point, his legs moving on their own toward the fire. Gran Torino realized his intentions. Your blast might make the fire bigger. You can't risk that. We'll find another hero and send them this way. Midori acknowledged that, but he refused to accept it. He knew what happened when heroes simply stood idly by, waiting for the right quirk to come along. He knew the consequences. He had experienced them firsthand. We have to wait for someone with the right quirk to show up. He'd seen it. Someone will come eventually. He'd lived it. We just need that kid to hold on a bit longer. And in another universe, Bakugo had died from it. He approached the fire from the side. He knew just a puff of air from either his blast or Gran Torino's quirk had a risk of growing the fire instead, but he was resourceful. He was a scavenger. He'd make do with what he had, and he fought to the end beyond anyway. With his momentum from the run, he stepped into a deep lunge, scraping his bare hand against the sidewalk. DT rushed naturally, mixing lightly with the pavement to create a thick layer of dust and powder, and with insane precision, a little help from the wind, he continued to swing upward, blasting the coarse air mixture right into the fire. The flames were smothered, crumbling into nothing more than pitiful heaps of ash. Almost immediately the person, a man trapped inside, had rushed out into the now safe entryway. Thank you so much. I thought I'd be trapped inside my own store. Midori offered his other gloved hand to navigate the nearby debris. Of course, sir. Are you all right? Owari! Gran Torino yelled. We need to keep moving. Midori wasted no time, pointing in the other direction, back toward the derailed train where there was no doubt reinforcements by now. Head in that direction. There'll be EMTs and police to keep you safe. The man thanked him again and ran off, almost like clockwork. Gami came rushing at him with that same direction. Midori tilted his head slightly down, making sure most of his expression was hidden, mainly his mouth. We're heading into the city. Stay close. The ghost nodded sharply, and Midori ran back to Gran Torino, who quickly grabbed him again by his costume and rocketed back into the sky. Through the wind and smoke, he could clearly see multiple massive fires the size of adjacent buildings, all centered in the heart of Hosu City, and even from their height, Midori could easily make out a familiar hulking stature of lurking Nomu. Holy shit! The rest was taken by the wind, yet not forgotten. There had been at least 3, including the Nomu that had escaped from the train just before. There were dozens of heroes scattered on the ground, all spread thin between damage control, civilian protection, and combat engagement. But they looked battered, even from this high place up in the sky. Gran Torino grimaced, and suddenly Midori realized how much of a liability he was to a hero like this. He likely couldn't move as fluidly carrying such a weighty payload, and damn it if they didn't need to move. Drop me off on a rooftop so you can rush in. I can catch up. The hero glanced at him, but even with his messy hair tussling his face, his look of seriousness was not lost. Gran Torino grunted but complied, landing briefly on a nearby building to let go of Midoriya before launching back into the fray. The teen took a quick breather, trying to catch himself back up to the current state of things. Everything was a mess. Everything was an absolute mess. What the hell had happened? What the hell was he going to do? He needed to back up Gran Torino, but it was long past dark, and this one inevitable fear that had been plaguing him the last 2 days was at the forefront of his mind. Gami had finally caught up again, slowing to a stop at his side on a rooftop. What? We need to split up. What? We cannot stick together? He stuttered uncharacteristically. It is dangerous out here. Ida's still out there somewhere. We need to start covering ground now, Midori commanded. You start. I'll join in a bit. We'll meet up when we find each other. But I do not want to leave. He let out a vicious bark. We don't have time for this right now. Ida's life is at stake. I'm not betting on getting lucky again. Gami froze momentarily before reluctantly nodding and flying off without a word. Something sour brewed in the teen's gut, but he pushed it aside dismissively, blasting himself off the roof. He leapt from building to building, rapidly approaching the chaotic heart of the city as he saw it from above. Just in his sights with Gran Torino cutting through an elongated Nomu tongue with his quirk to save some civilians, and if he hadn't been conditioned by the sheer inhumanity of the USJ Nomu, he would have been shaken by the way this one had showed no pain at having its extremity shredded. It reached, not in agony from the attack, but rather in retribution, coiling the remains of its tongue into a sharp point right at the elder hero. Midori shot off the building much in the same way he had the night before, to cut off the burglar they'd apprehended, with the same lack of hesitance and pure thoughtlessness. He flew at the Nomu at breakneck speeds. Just as he got in close enough, he raised his hands in front of him in a counterbalance blast, both redirecting the attack away from Gran Torino as well as quickly decelerating his movement. The hero caught him before he fell from whiplash as a thanks, before rushing back in against the monster. He now had the opportunity to see the damage up close and personal. The pavement was shattered into spiderwebs. Cars flipped onto their sides, raging fires and unstoppable smoke seeping into the air. It was a living hell. A Nomu with massive wings circled above, bellowing a piercing cry into the cacophony of chaos. Heroes were scattered everywhere, some injured, some not, all trying to protect each other as they stared down the impossible. Midori couldn't even die, and he still wanted to throw up at the sheer overwhelmingness. He was just about to move in to assist Gran Torino when another hero caught his eye. Manuel's signature blue fish helmet had cut through the contrasting blazing reds and billowing blacks of the immediate area, darting back and forth as he seemed to be searching for something. Wait, wasn't Ida interning with... Ida wasn't here. Ida wasn't here. And without even a second thought, just like earlier, Midori rushed away from Gran Torino, away from the mess that was the heart of the city. He ran far from the noise, blasting himself back up to the tops of buildings once more. Ida was looking for the hero killer. He hadn't listened to him. Of course he hadn't listened to him. The thought sank like metal in water, hitting the bottom of his stomach like a lead weight. He could already be too late. Ida could already be... He moved faster, jumping across buildings with no more than a second between, ears straining and searching for quiet noises in an already silent neighborhood, far from the disaster in the heart. And then he heard it, the noise that haunted him in his sleep, the sharp drawl of a metal blade. He didn't speak. He didn't think. He simply heard and responded, leaping off the roof of a building that he was on and ricocheting off the walls of an abandoned alleyway. Not a thought ran through his brain as he shot toward the hero killer out of nowhere, counterblasting equally as suddenly to send the murderer and his sword flying away from Ida and clattering to the pavement. He dropped to the floor in a crouch, body almost completely engulfed by darkness. His costume hid him well, short cloak and coattails serving to cover his limbs completely, and in the few precious seconds he had left, Midori reached for his phone, stuffed away in one of his utility pouches. He was really an idiot. He didn't even have Gran Torino's number, not that he was sure the elder even had a phone. All he knew was that he had the numbers of his classmates, and still, out of nothing but desperation for a future unlike the one he saw, he stealthily sent his location out to all contacts, hoping his salvation would somehow know to answer. Midori looked up, his hat no longer obscuring his face, only to meet the eyes of a confused villain and an equally confused friend. Ida stared at him, with an indescribable emotion in his eyes. What? But Midori met him in return with an emotion of such firmness its presence shook the air like his blast had. Ida, I came to save you. All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 41 of Deku and Death. Chapter 42 will be next, which will continue the fight in Hosu. Hope you guys are still enjoying, and as always, thank you so much for listening.